Welcome back to another MOTOBOB video, and today Aprilia announced a brand new small to mid capacity sports bike called the RS457, and it looks like it'll perfectly bridge the gap between their little RS125 and the awesome middleweight RS660. Now I think this bike is going to look really appealing to anyone who wants a slice of the Aprilia action, but perhaps is on a bit of a budget or of course on a learner license. So in this video I'll tell you absolutely everything that you need to know about it with the 7 best features. Now first up, there's a brand new 457cc parallel twin that makes the maximum possible power output for an A2 license compliant motorcycle at 47 horsepower peak. Now that's pretty good versus the competition, so stuff like the Kawasaki Ninja 400, that comes in at 45 horsepower, the KTM RC390 comes in at 43, the Yamaha R3 at 41, and it's really only the Honda CBR 500R that can match it, but that bike is pretty weighty, and so on the road it'll almost certainly be a performance disadvantage. So yes, it's good on power, but also I think one of the real selling points when it hits dealers is the fact that you get a beautiful sounding 270-degree crank in this parallel twin, which gives it the sound and feel of the bigger bikes above it in the Aprilia lineup, like the RS660. Now, bikes like the KTM are single cylinders, and so it doesn't quite do it for me in terms of acoustic sweetness in the same way that a 270 twin does. The Honda and the Kawasaki, well, they are parallel twins, but they get a 180-degree crank, which sounds a bit agricultural. So a bit of a V-twin-esque roar is surely going to make the riding experience on this bike feel a little more exciting and more tempting for potential buyers who realistically are probably going to be aspiring to the bigger sports bikes in the Aprilia range, but they're simply limited by their age and license. Plus, with an aftermarket exhaust to let it breathe a bit, I reckon this bike would sound absolutely fantastic. Now onto the chassis, and much like the RS660, this one gets an aluminium twin beam frame that uses the engine as a stress member, and that helps to maximize rigidity whilst also saving weight. The swing arm is steel as opposed to the aluminium of the bigger sibling, presumably to save on cost, and so there might be a bit of a forfeit in terms of weight there, and it is unsprung weight, which does make life a little bit more difficult for the rear shock. But externally, it is nicely contoured and it doesn't cheapen the looks. The rest of the chassis is reasonably spec'd with an upside down fork that gives you preload adjustment along with preload adjustment on the shock. There's a single disc up front with a 4-pot radially mounted caliper from Brembo's budget-friendly sub-brand called Bybre, and tyres are suitably slender for this level of power with a 160 section at the rear. And the TVS Eurogrip brand on the tyre walls gives away the Indian manufacturer of this bike, but to be honest, I've absolutely no experience on them, so we'll have to wait to ride one to see if they're any good. It isn't super premium top drawer stuff on this bike, but it is appropriate for the size of it and the power level and the weight of it. And they'll also be wanting to hit a very aggressive price point given that it's targeted at younger and newer riders, and so getting carried away with all the latest top-end flashy components wouldn't really have served that purpose. As for weight, well, they're claiming in the press release that this bike has the best power to weight ratio in its class. I mentioned earlier that the engine produces the maximum possible 47 horsepower for an A2 license compliant bike, and it tips the scales at 159 kilograms dry or 175 kilograms wet. Now it took a bit of digging to get the wet weights for some of the competition that we just mentioned, and some of them do come in quite a bit lighter, but given that extra little bit of power that the Aprilia produces, it does just edge it, just beating the Kawasaki Ninja 400, which does run it very close but can't make up for that little bit of a power disadvantage. So nice work indeed from Aprilia on this one, and it should make for a lively little bike. Ergonomically though, you can see from the press release that they've specifically tried not to make it too aggressive despite the sports bike styling. They call out the clip-on bar specifically as being above the top yoke, so not too low, and that gives it, in their opinion, a moderate riding position that's the right balance of sportiness and roadability. Now the RS660, to be fair, balances this out extremely well. It's a super comfortable bike considering it's a sports bike. I feel like you could ride it all day day, no problem, but you can still drop your elbows and tuck in behind the fairing if you want to get a bit of a lick on. The peg position is high enough for some decent ground clearance, but it's not super cramped, and it's pretty reasonable in the seat height as well. So for me, the ergonomics are one of the standout features of that bike, and it's a sports bike I could actually see myself owning and generally using for day-to-day stuff. I'd expect more of the same here with the 457, maybe a little bit more relaxed because it's beginner friendly and those riders are naturally going to be less concerned with track days and more biased towards road riding and commuting, but all whilst carrying that exciting sports bike image. Technologically, it's pretty decent considering what you'd expect at this sort of price point. Naturally, it gets a ride-by-wire throttle, and that allows them to deliver 3 different riding modes with varying levels of throttle response. You also get 3 traction control settings as well as being able to switch it off. Now, this bike also gets dual-channel ABS, a TFT display, backlit switchgear, which is great news if you're riding at night, and there's also a quick shifter in the accessories catalog if you want to add clutchless shifting up and down. But a big part of selling bikes in this market will have to be the looks, because of course, if you're an A2 rider, you're probably dreaming of owning a proper big sports bike like the RS V4, and so I think it's great that they haven't watered down the Aprilia design language for this one with all the styling cues that you'd expect from one of their sports bikes, but just in a smaller form factor. Specifically, the lighting goes a long way to making this bike look quite premium, because you get the same LED headlight design as the other RS bikes, and it's lit up with that daytime running light, and it's also got the integrated indicators to keep that front end looking very clean. The taillight is another signature design feature that really does define the back end of the bike, and overall, I think it looks pretty special for an A2 motorcycle. Paintwork is also pretty loud and proud with the typical Aprilia colors of black, red and purple, or you've got a white version which I also think looks pretty great, and then naturally you've got a more stealthy black, which is something all manufacturers seem to offer on pretty much all bikes. Some of these get the red wheels too, which I think give it a bit more of a sporty vibe, and I think these bold colors and graphics are perfectly suited to the personality of this bike. And like I say, if you're on an A2 license, you want something that looks the nuts, and these, for me, certainly do. Now, there's no confirmed pricing as of yet. We don't even really have the full spec sheet with all the torque figures and seat height and things like that. But of all the competition that we've mentioned so far, between the sort of 5.5 to 6.5 grand price range looks about right. The KTM is probably the bargain of the bunch, and no doubt the fact that it's built in India will have helped them to hit that super tempting price point. So given that it's the same story for this Aprilia that's also going to be manufactured in India, it'll be interesting to see if they can get it somewhere near. Generally, I think this looks like a brilliant new option in this market. It's got a little more design flair and excitement and aspiration than perhaps what's already on offer. That 270-degree crank is a big one for me as well. Having ridden the CBR 500R, for example, it's a great bike. And like I say, a little bit weighty, but a 180 crank just always feels a bit flat to me. And similar for the RC390 from KTM, it's a great bike, really enjoy borrowing it, very fun in the handling, but a single's always going to get a bit vibey when you get it to the top end of the rev range. This bike, the RS457, should offer a little more smoothness, being a twin, but also that compelling soundtrack that will give you a little shade of their 660 or V4. As always, I'd love to know what you think of it though, so do let me know down in the comments below. If you're new here and you want to see more of the latest motorcycle news right here on YouTube, then please do hit subscribe. Many thanks for watching today, and we'll catch you in the next one.